Shut down the entire factory immediately. A federal marshal barked, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel rafters of Vance Precision Manufacturing. Behind him, three other officers in high-visibility vests stood at the main loading dock, blockading the four heavy semi-trucks packed with $1.3 million worth of custom-engineered suspension linkages. Lawrence Vance, my former boss, stood on the concrete floor, his face transitioning from a furious red to a pale, ghostly white. He clutched a stack of legal documents Clarence Miller had just served him, his hands shaking so violently that the papers rustled like dry leaves in the wind. Lawrence looked at the officers, then at the silent assembly lines, and finally at me. I stood near the exit gate, hands in my pockets, offering nothing but a cold, knowing smile. He had no idea that the ground beneath his multi-million-dollar empire had just vanished. To understand how a $24 million manufacturing plant ended up dead silent. On a Monday morning, you have to go back to 2008. That was the year I joined Vance Precision Manufacturing, or VPM. Back then, the company was run by Richard Vance, Lawrence's father. Richard was a self-made man, a machinist who smelled of coolant and heavy grease, and who could tell if a lathe was out of alignment just by listening to the hum of the spindle. He hired me as a senior design engineer when I was 28 years old, fresh off a 6-year stint at a major automotive supplier. For the first 8 years, VPM was a mid-tier machine shop, producing standard ball joints, tie rods, and sway bar links for commercial fleets. We made a decent living, but we were constantly squeezed by larger competitors with automated lines. My daily routine was simple: arrive at 6:30 a.m., grab a cup of battery acid strength coffee from the break room, and spend 10 hours in front of a dual-monitor CAD workstation, optimizing toolpaths, calculating shear stress, and tweaking drafts. I lived and breathed mechanical engineering. I knew every micron of tolerance on our tooling dies, and the shop floor machinists respected me because I didn't just draw lines on a screen. I actually knew how to set up a 4-axis CNC mill. Then came 2016. VPM was on the brink of losing its biggest prospect, Michigan Heavy Duty, or MHD. MHD was developing a new Class 8 commercial truck chassis, but they had a massive engineering roadblock. High-frequency harmonic vibrations were causing their steering gear boxes and suspension control arms to shear under heavy loads. VPM's standard catalog parts failed MHD's bench tests within 48 hours. Richard Vance came to my office, looking exhausted, and asked if we could design something custom. I told him we could, but we needed a budget for rapid prototyping and simulation software. That was when Lawrence, who was then VPM's vice president of finance, stepped in. Lawrence had a fancy business degree from an expensive school and zero understanding of how metal actually bends. He vetoed the budget, calling my proposal a useless science project. He told his father that VPM should focus on selling cheaper commodity joints rather than wasting money on research and development. But I knew the physics was sound. I went home and spent the next 7 months working out of my own 2-car garage. I bought a second-hand SLA 3-dimensional printer, ordered raw polyurethane billets, and spent my nights drafting a multi-link elastomeric coupling that could isolate 3-axis vibrations while maintaining structural integrity under 50,000 foot-pounds of torque. I called it the Aerolink suspension system. I spent my own money filing the design patent. On November 12, 2016, I officially submitted the application, and in mid-2018, the United States Patent and Trademark Office granted me U.S. patent number 10,845,921. By 2018, VPM's traditional business was drying up. Richard Vance, realizing the company was sliding toward bankruptcy, begged me to let VPM manufacture the Aerolink design. We sat down with Richard and my patent attorney, Clarence Miller, to draft a licensing agreement. Signed on September 14, 2018, the contract was simple but ironclad. I granted VPM an exclusive non-transferable license to manufacture and sell the Aerolink suspension system. In return, VPM agreed to pay me my standard engineering salary, plus a 1.5% profit share royalty on all Aerolink gross sales, paid out annually on November 30. But Clarence insisted on adding one specific safeguard, Clause 11A. It stated that the patent license was tied directly to my personal employment at VPM. If the company terminated my employment for any reason other than documented willful misconduct, the exclusive license to U.S. patent number 10,845. 921 would terminate automatically, immediately, and without notice. Richard Vance didn't hesitate to sign it. He knew my worth, and he knew that without the Aerolink, VPM was dead. Within 12 months of signing that agreement, MHD signed a $12 million annual contract to source Aerolink assemblies for their entire heavy-duty fleet. The product was a massive hit. It single-handedly saved VPM, eventually accounting for 65% of the company's $24 million annual revenue. For years, the factory hummed, the shipping docks were constantly busy, and I ran the engineering department like a well-oiled machine. But Richard retired in 2024, handing the reins to Lawrence. And Lawrence had a plan to make VPM leaner. He didn't see an engineer who saved the company. He saw an expensive employee who was taking a massive bite out of his margins. Lawrence Vance's management style was built entirely on spreadsheet metrics and corporate buzzwords. He had spent his first 2 years as CEO replacing seasoned shop floor supervisors with low-cost shift leads and cutting our quality control budget by 15%. He constantly talked about optimization, but to Lawrence, optimization simply meant paying people less for the same amount of sweat. He hated the fact that my contract guaranteed me a 1.5% profit share bonus on the Aerolink sales. By October of 2026, our shipments of the Aerolink to Michigan Heavy Duty had reached $15.6 million for the fiscal year. That meant on November 30, VPM owed me exactly $234,000 in royalties. On top of my base salary, to a guy like Lawrence, seeing a design engineer receive a check that size was an intolerable insult to his executive authority. He spent weeks looking for a loophole, but VPM's legal department told him the 2018 contract was watertight. So, Lawrence decided to play a different game. He would eliminate my position entirely, claim redundancy, and rely on VPM's database of CAD designs to keep the factory running without paying me another dime. On Friday, November 13, 2026, at 4:30 p.m., I received an automated calendar invite for a meeting in the executive boardroom. When I walked in, Lawrence was sitting at the head of the polished mahogany table, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than a machinist's monthly wage. Next to him sat a young man who looked barely old enough to shave. It was Oliver Vance, Lawrence's 24-year-old nephew. Oliver was wearing a brand-new VPM polo shirt and had a smug, self-important smirk plastered across his face. He had graduated 3 months prior with a generic business administration degree and had 0 hours of practical manufacturing experience. Lawrence gestured for me to sit, not even bothering to look me in the eye. He slid a thin manila folder across the table toward me. I opened it. Inside was a termination notice citing corporate restructuring and the consolidation of the design engineering department. Brandon, we appreciate your 18 years of service to Vance Precision. Lawrence began, his voice carrying that rehearsed, robotic corporate tone. But as CEO, I have to make the hard decisions to keep VPM competitive. The board has decided to streamline our overhead. As of today, the position of Chief Design Engineer is redundant. We are restructuring the department under a new Director of Engineering Operations, and Oliver here will be taking over the daily management of the CAD database and production scheduling. I looked at Oliver. He leaned forward, tapping his tablet. Yeah, Brandon. Oliver chimed in, trying to sound authoritative. We're moving toward a cloud-based automated CAD workflow. The legacy filing systems you've been using are pretty outdated. I've already audited the server directories, and we've got all the mechanical drawings and toolpath files for the Aerolink system saved. We'll take it from here. I looked back at Lawrence. He slid a second document toward me, a severance agreement. We're offering you 2 weeks of base salary as severance, Lawrence said, leaning back in his leather chair. All you need to do is sign this standard release of claims, and we'll process your final check along with your unused PTO. Of course, this release also clarifies that all intellectual property, design files, and engineering data currently stored on VPM servers remain the exclusive, unrestricted property of Vance Precision Manufacturing. I skimmed the release document. It was a classic corporate trap. Section 4, written in dense 8-point font, was a comprehensive waiver. Signing it would not only waive my right to sue for wrongful termination, but it would also retroactively transfer all personal patent holdings related to products manufactured by VPM to the corporation. Lawrence was trying to steal my design patent for a measly 2 weeks of base salary, about $5,000, and wipe out the $234,000 he owed me in profit share bonuses. I closed the folder, slid the severance agreement back across the table, and looked at Lawrence. "I won't be signing this," I said quietly. Lawrence's eyes narrowed. The smug look on his face faltered for a fraction of a second. "Brandon, be realistic. If you don't sign it, you don't get the severance. And you're still terminated. We don't need your permission to run this factory. We have the CAD databases, we have the CNC tooling programs, and we have the machines. Oliver has already cloned your local hard drives. The Aerolink is our product now." "I understand," I replied. "I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't mention the patent license, and I certainly didn't mention Clause 11 When you are about to pull the pin on a grenade, you don't warn the guy holding it." I stood up, walked back down to my office, and began packing my personal belongings into a single cardboard box. I packed my desk mugs, my reference manuals, and the original framed design patent certificate for U.S. patent number 10,845,921. Oliver was already standing at my desk holding an external hard drive, waiting to lock me out of my workstation. He smirked as I walked past him. "Don't worry, Brandon," Oliver sneered. "I'll make sure your CAD files don't get dusty. Make sure you look closely at the tolerances on the hub splines," I said softly, loading my box into the back of my pickup truck. "They can be a bit tricky." I drove out of the VPM parking lot at 5:15 p.m. on Friday. The factory was running its evening shift, the furnaces glowing orange through the high windows, and the mechanical thud of the stamping presses shaking the gravel in the parking lot. It was the last time that facility would run under Lawrence Vance's control. On Saturday morning at 9 a.m., I met my patent attorney, Clarence Miller, at his office in downtown Detroit. Clarence was a veteran intellectual property lawyer who had spent 40 years defending independent inventors and engineers against predatory corporations. I laid my copy of the September 14, 2018 patent license agreement on his desk next to my termination letter and the unsigned severance waiver. Clarence put on his reading glasses and read through the documents. A slow, thin smile crept across his face as he reached Clause 11 He tapped the page with his pen. "Lawrence Vance is an idiot," Clarence said, leaning back in his leather chair. "He thinks that because VPM has the physical CAD files and the CNC milling machines on their floor, they own the right to manufacture the product. He doesn't understand the difference between data storage and intellectual property ownership. The moment he handed you this termination letter on Friday without documenting any willful misconduct, VPM's license to U.S. patent, number 10,845,921 expired. As of Friday at 4:30 p.m., they have zero legal right to manufacture, assemble, or ship a single Aerolink unit." "What's our next move?" I asked. "We file for an emergency temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction," Clarence replied. "Under Title 35, Section 283 of the United States Code, federal courts have the authority to grant injunctions in accordance with the principles of equity to prevent the violation of any right secured by patent. We will file it electronically in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. We will cite immediate, irreparable financial and reputational harm if VPM continues to manufacture and distribute your patented design without authorization." Clarence worked through Saturday afternoon, drafting the motion. We attached the original patent registration, the 2018 licensing agreement, the termination letter, and a sworn affidavit from me detailing the events of Friday afternoon. By 6 p.m. on Saturday, the electronic filing was complete. Because of the scale of VPM's commercial operations and the clear-cut nature of the contract violation, Clarence requested an expedited review from the duty judge. On Sunday afternoon, Federal District Judge Evelyn Carter signed the emergency temporary restraining order. The order was absolute. Vance Precision Manufacturing was commanded to immediately cease all manufacturing, assembly, shipment, and sale of any product incorporating the designs protected under U.S. patent number 10,845,921. While Clarence and I were securing federal court orders, Lawrence and Oliver were celebrating their corporate triumph. I later learned from a friendly supervisor on the assembly line that Lawrence had hosted a celebratory dinner on Saturday night for VPM's senior managers, bragging about how he had streamlined VPM's engineering operations and eliminated over $250,000 in wasteful annual overhead by getting rid of a legacy employee. Oliver had spent Saturday afternoon at the VPM plant, bragging to the shift foreman that he was now running the engineering department. He had authorized the warehouse team to finalize the packaging of a massive order for Michigan Heavy Duty. It was VPM's largest shipment of the quarter, 4,000 units of the Aerolink suspension system, valued at $1.3 million. The units had been loaded onto 4 flatbed logistics semi-trucks parked in the VPM shipping yard, scheduled to depart at 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning to meet MHD's tight assembly line schedule in Detroit. Under VPM's supply contract with MHD, VPM was bound by a strict just-in-time delivery schedule. If VPM failed to deliver the components on time, they were subject to a liquidated damages penalty of $1.5 million, plus the immediate right for MHD to terminate the entire $12 million annual agreement. Lawrence knew this, but he was completely confident. He believed that with me out of the picture, VPM would ship the parts, collect the $1.3 million, and Oliver would get the credit for a seamless transition. What Lawrence and Oliver failed to realize was that manufacturing custom automotive components isn't just about loading files into a computer. The Aerolink system used a proprietary alloy and a specific heat treatment cycle that prevented the metal from becoming brittle under load. The exact heat treatment temperatures and quench times were not saved as the standard CAD metadata. I kept those parameters in my personal engineering logbook, the book that was currently sitting in the box on my dining room table. At 7 a.m. on Monday morning, I met Clarence and 2 Deputy United States Marshals at a diner 2 blocks away from the VPM manufacturing plant. The marshals were there to serve the federal injunction. I took a sip of my coffee, looked at the gray Michigan sky, and felt a deep sense of calm. The machinery of justice was about to collide with Lawrence Vance's arrogance, and I was going to have a front-row seat. At 8:15 a.m. on Monday, the sky over the VPM plant was dark with heavy autumn clouds. The 4 semi-trucks loaded with the Aerolink suspension components were lined up near the main gate, their diesel engines idling with a deep rumble that vibrated through the gravel. The drivers were signing their shipping manifests, preparing to make the 2-hour drive to the Michigan Heavy Duty Assembly Plant. I walked through the glass double doors of the VPM administration building, flanked by Clarence Miller and 2 deputy U.S. Marshals. The receptionist looked up, startled by the presence of federal officers, and immediately dialed the executive suite. Within 2 minutes, Lawrence Vance descended the stairs, flanked by Oliver and the VP of Operations. "What is the meaning of this?" Lawrence demanded, his voice echoing in the lobby. "Brandon, you don't work here anymore. If you're here to make a scene about your termination, I'll have security escort you off the premises." Clarence stepped forward, pulling a blue folder from his briefcase. "Mr. Vance, my name is Clarence Miller, legal counsel for Brandon Cole. I am serving you with an emergency temporary restraining order issued yesterday by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan." He handed the papers to Lawrence. "Under federal law, you are commanded to immediately cease all manufacturing, assembly, distribution, and sale of any components utilizing U.S. patent number 10,845,921. That includes the 4 trucks idling in your yard." Lawrence snatched the documents, his eyes scanning the court seal and the judge's signature. His face flushed deep red. "This is ridiculous. We own these designs. Brandon was our employee when he drew them. This is corporate property. You can't stop these trucks. We have a contract with Michigan Heavy Duty." "Mr. Vance," the lead marshal said, his voice calm but completely unyielding, "if those trucks move past that gate, you will be in contempt of a federal court order. That carries immediate personal fines, corporate sanctions, and potential jail time. I suggest you tell your drivers to shut down their engines." Oliver stepped forward, waving his tablet. "Uncle Lawrence, this is a bluff. Our internal server logs show Brandon uploaded these CAD files to our engineering database 3 years ago. The company owns the database files. They can't lock us out of our own servers. Clarence looked at Oliver with a mixture of pity and amusement. Young man, the database files are VPM's property. The intellectual property rights to the design itself, however, belong exclusively to Brandon Cole. Under Clause 11(a) of the 2018 Patent License Agreement, VPM's license terminated the moment Brandon was fired without cause. Any further production or distribution constitutes willful patent infringement under Title 35, Section 271 of the United States Code. Under Section 284, VPM will be liable for treble damages. Lawrence looked from the documents to the marshals, his breathing becoming shallow. He turned to the VP of Operations. Tell the drivers to turn off the engines, move the trucks back to the loading docks. By 9 a.m., the factory floor was dead silent. The stamping presses had stopped their rhythmic thumping. The robotic welding arms sat frozen in mid-air, and the assembly line workers stood in small groups, whispering and looking toward the executive offices. The silence in the plant was deafening. At 9:15 a.m., Lawrence's desk phone began to ring. It was Walter Henderson, the director of procurement at Michigan Heavy Duty. I could hear Henderson's voice screaming through the receiver from across the room. VPM was supposed to deliver the first batch of 4,000 Aerolink units by 10 a.m. Vance, Henderson roared. Where are the trucks? Our logistics tracking shows they haven't even left your yard. Our assembly line in Detroit is scheduled to start the new chassis run at noon. If we don't have those suspension components, we have to halt the entire assembly line. That costs us $50,000 an hour. Lawrence was sweating profusely, his collar unbuttoned. Walter, we have a minor logistical delay. We are resolving a compliance issue with our design documentation. We should have the trucks on the road shortly. You have until noon, Lawrence, Henderson barked. If those parts aren't at our receiving dock by 12 p.m., we are canceling the entire $12 million contract, and we will enforce the $1.5 million liquidated damages penalty for line shutdown. Do you understand me? Solve it. The line went dead. Lawrence stared at the phone, his hand trembling. He looked at Oliver, who was staring at his tablet, desperately searching the patent database for a loophole that didn't exist. Lawrence picked up the receiver again and dialed my cell phone. I answered on the first ring. I was sitting in Clarence's office, drinking a fresh cup of coffee. Brandon, Lawrence said, his voice tight and desperate. We need to resolve this. This is sabotage. You're putting the entire company at risk. I'm prepared to offer you your job back with a 10% salary increase, and we will pay your standard base salary through the weekend. Sabotage. Lawrence? I asked, my voice calm. I didn't file the termination papers. You did. I didn't draft the severance agreement that tried to steal my intellectual property. You did. Under the terms of the contract your father signed in 2018, you made the decision to terminate the patent license when you fired me. I am no longer an employee of VPM. Brandon, please, Lawrence pleaded, the arrogance completely gone from his voice. MHD is going to cancel the contract. We'll lose $12 million. The company will go under. We can work out a deal. You want to talk about a deal, Lawrence? You can speak to Clarence. His rate is $600 an hour, and he doesn't work on weekends or holidays. Have a good day. I hung up. I looked at Clarence, who was writing notes on a yellow pad. The pressure was mounting, and Lawrence Vance was about to crack under the weight of his own incompetence. By Monday afternoon at 3 p.m., the crisis at Vance Precision Manufacturing had reached the board of directors. Richard Vance, the retired founder who still held 51% of VPM's voting shares, had received an emergency alert from the company's chief financial officer. Richard had boarded a private charter flight from his retirement home in Florida and landed in Detroit by 7 p.m. He went straight to the plant. On Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., Clarence Miller received a call from Richard himself. Richard's voice was tired, but it had the old machinist's grit. He asked if we could meet in VPM's main boardroom at 10 a.m. When Clarence and I arrived at the plant, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Lawrence was sitting in the corner of the boardroom, his eyes bloodshot, looking like he hadn't slept a wink. Oliver sat next to him, his iPad closed, looking small and defeated. Richard Vance sat at the center of the table. his old calloused hands folded in front of him. Richard looked at me and nodded slowly. "Brandon, thank you for coming." He turned to his son. "Lawrence, leave the room. Take Oliver with you. Dad, we can fight this." Lawrence protested, his voice cracking. "We can file an appeal. We can find a way to work around his design." "Leave the room, Lawrence," Richard repeated, his voice quiet but sharp. "You've done enough damage. You tried to run a precision machining business like a department store. You fired the only man who kept our machines running to save a few dollars, and you've cost us a $12 million contract. Get out, and take your nephew with you. He is no longer employed here." Lawrence opened his mouth to speak, but the look in his father's eyes shut him down. Lawrence and Oliver stood up, gathered their folders, and slunk out of the boardroom. Once the door clicked shut, Richard looked at me. "Brandon, I apologize for my son's arrogance. He doesn't know the difference between a mill and a lathe. He thought he could squeeze you out and keep the Aerolink design. I built this company with my bare hands, and I know you did the same for the Aerolink. We need that license back. MHD has agreed to give us a 48-hour extension on the shipment, but if we don't deliver by tomorrow morning, they will cancel the contract and enforce the penalty. VPM will go under. What is your price?" Clarence Miller slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It detailed our settlement terms, which we had drafted on Monday evening. "Richard, I'm not coming back as an employee," I said. "The trust is gone. But I am willing to sell U.S. patent number 10,845,921 to VPM outright so the company can continue manufacturing the Aerolink system without restriction." Richard read the terms aloud. 1. An outright buyout of the design patent for $4,500,000, paid via immediate wire transfer. 2. Payment of the outstanding 1.5% profit share bonus for the 2026 fiscal year, totaling $234,000. 3. A 2-year consulting agreement at $20,000 per month, under which Brandon will provide quality oversight, train a new lead engineer, and supply the proprietary alloy heat treatment specifications. Brandon will report directly and exclusively to the board of directors, with 0 reporting lines to Lawrence Vance. Richard looked up from the sheet. $4.5 million is a heavy price, Brandon. It will drain our cash reserves. It's a lot cheaper than losing a $12 million contract, paying a $1.5 million late penalty to MHD, and facing a federal patent infringement lawsuit for the units you've already manufactured," Clarence noted calmly. "And it saves VPM from liquidation." Richard stared at the paper for a long moment. He knew the math was brutal, but it was accurate. He looked at me, seeing the engineer who had saved his company in 2016. He picked up his pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page. "Call the bank," Richard told the CFO, who was waiting outside the door. "Process the wire transfer immediately." Within 45 minutes, Clarence verified that the funds, a total of $4,734,000, had cleared into my escrow account. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a flash drive containing the proprietary heat treatment parameters, the alloy ratios, and the quality control protocols, and placed it on the table. I also signed the patent assignment documents, transferring U.S. patent number 10,845,921 to Vance Precision Manufacturing. Clarence immediately contacted the federal court to withdraw our motion for a preliminary injunction, lifting the temporary restraining order. By 1 p.m. on Tuesday, the VPM factory floor was back in motion. The stamping presses resumed their heavy thumping, the warehouse doors opened, and the 4 semi-trucks loaded with Aerolink components finally pulled out of the gate, heading toward Detroit to save the MHD assembly line. I walked out of the VPM building for the final time as a wealthy man. Lawrence Vance was officially stripped of his CEO title, demoted to a minor purchasing clerk position, and moved to a small windowless office near the boiler room, where he could no longer interfere with engineering or production. Oliver was sent packing, back to looking for entry-level business jobs with a ruined reputation. As I drove my pickup truck out of the parking lot, I looked at the black smoke rising from the foundry stacks. For 18 years, I had worked in the heat and the grease, creating value with my own mind and hands, while greedy executives thought they could treat engineers as disposable commodities. They had tried to take my work, my bonus, and my dignity. But in the end, they learned the hard way that you can't run the machinery if you don't own the keys.